Hey everyone, my name is Kenny Johnston. I am here with Jason Yavorska, our Director of Product covering CI/CD. Jason's last week at GitLab is this week, and I was trying to think of topics that I would really love to pick Jason's brain about. And the one that I came up with that's we're going to discuss today is principles of GitLab-ci.yml syntax, I guess is the best word. And Jason, you can kind of help me with the language to make sure I'm on point. For me, one of the things that, having worked with Jason for the last almost 2 years, one of the things that he's continually impressed upon me is that our CI product kind of comes with its own almost programming language-like part of the product in the CI/YAML syntax itself, and that we need to be careful about it, and that there are some core principles that Jason has expressed to me, but I kind of wanted to ask you more questions. And in my mind, if this results in a great discussion that then I can take or others can take to document, here's kind of like the principles upon which we continue to iterate on our CI/YAML definition, that would be the best outcome. So anyone else on this call, I seeded with a bunch of questions that I just had about this topic for Jason, but feel free to jump in and add your own. Maybe I'm gonna jump in ahead of one of my first ones, Jason, and just say, I have been using words like syntax and DSL and other terms like that interchangeably. Can you help me make sure I'm on the correct taxonomy?
Sure. Syntax is probably the right one. DSL is like when you actually implement it inside of a programming language, so that you may be using some kind of base syntax. Groovy tends to be a common one that's used for that, but there are others. And then you add your own keywords and data structures and things like that, and interface points between your application. And so we specifically don't have a DSL because one of the I guess important principles that we've kept with our configuration is that it isn't so complex as if you were to implement it as a programming language. If you were going to go down that road, I think it would just be better to implement it in a real full programming language, to be honest. But there's a lot of benefits to having your configuration be, more static, easier to understand tends to be the main benefit, but also just kind of like simpler to get started than when you have a full DSL.
Okay, cool. So I should use the word syntax. We do not have a DSL. And in some ways, we want to avoid having something as complex that it would warrant one. Okay.
Yeah. One thing to be aware of that we do have is kind of procedural generation of the configuration. So we have our GitLab-ci.yml syntax. We also have a feature called dynamic child pipelines, and well, just dynamic pipelines in general, where you can run typically a YAML templating language and generate the YAML config at runtime. So that sort of gives you, at least in theory, the benefit of having still a simple, configuration language that doesn't have loops and logic built into it, but are also able to emit it when you need to do something custom.
Okay. Great. This is a little bit of a tangent because my other questions are also about like complexity, but I imagine in the past we have deprecated keywords in our YAML syntax. How have we done that? How have we managed it?
Yeah, it's very, very rare. Rare enough that I can't even think of one that we've done, but I'm sure we've gotten rid of something or other. The problem is that people write pipelines and then expect them to just kind of run without having to maintain them. And whenever we deprecate something, we create a administrative kind of like operational cost for everybody who's updated a pipeline. And a lot of times these will be pipelines that have been forgotten about or just kind of, assumed that they're working because they've been running for years. So when you delete things like that, you typically need to provide some kind of auto on-ramp or auto translation. So what we're more likely to do is to discourage a particular keyword, potentially implement it on the back end so that we introduce a new keyword. And if you use the old keyword, you actually go through the new code path because we sort of like translate it on the back end. And so in that way we can deprecate things. But yeah, it's really hard to ever actually just say like, yeah, there's no more only except keyword, for example, and you need to use rules instead, because we'll just break so many pipelines out there in the world that there's really no justification to break them.
Miguel had a follow-up.
Yeah, my follow-up is if you have decided if maybe you have decided to make a change, is there any way to automate the process for users? Maybe that you can, with the click of a button during the GitLab update, you can let administrators run a process where you kind of update all the pipelines that are in your instance, or
Yeah.
or do that for something like gitlab.com. Is there something like this?
We could build something like that for sure. We've never done it in the past. There's some complexities there in that, well, we've got gitlab.com, of course, where the scale is just huge. And if you imagine kind of going through a situation where we told everybody, hey, we're going to update all of your pipelines and it should work, but we can't guarantee it. It wouldn't really go everywhere. And even on an instance, just giving somebody a migration script that says, here, this is just going to run and it will auto translate, and then most of them will work, or even all of them will work, hopefully. It's just kind of like a logistically complicated thing to execute, but it is possible. And you could imagine, you know, if we ever did a V2 syntax or something like that, where we just kind of needed to, we reached a point where we needed to say, okay, there's a fundamental change within the syntax that we need to make. We're going to break things into two portions, and maybe we'll continue to support the legacy ones and we'll support the new ones. Then we might make some kind of automatic migration script for pipelines that can just translate from one to the other. But for small things, typically it's better to do what I mentioned, where you just kind of like handle it on the back end for them as best you can. Or if that's not possible, then just discourage it, document it so that people know, yeah, this still works, but you shouldn't do it because, you know, for these reasons, and here's what you should use instead and how to use it.
Cool, thank you. I didn't have any other questions about deprecation. Anybody else have any before I move on to the next one? Okay, so I'm gonna adjust my language. Really, I think the line is, how would you evaluate whether the syntax is getting too complex where it's nearing a DSL? And you just mentioned like maybe in some future we would reach the point where we needed a V2. I would imagine some of that would be simplification. How would you like guide the team to think about measuring and knowing when we had hit that too complex point?
Yeah, it's a tough one because there isn't necessarily a real clear answer, but it would be, we could be running into problems on being able to deliver new features, and that it just becomes so difficult to deliver new features related to the GitLab-ci.yml because we're maintaining all of this stuff and interconnected, and it becomes too complex for us to use and interact with. The other path is where it becomes too complex for customers to interact with. The GitLab-ci.yml syntax page is already quite long. It is a reference page, so it's meant to be a little bit long, but there will come a point where there's just so many different things that you can do to start that maybe we would say, okay, there's going to be a V2 syntax that's oriented around making things simpler to start, and that may become a moment. But again, you want to try to avoid that as best you can. And so all the conversations should be around, how can we not have to do this? How can we make it so that it's you know, easier to use the syntax we have? How can we document it better? How can we guide people? Because at that point you've split the user base into two halves potentially, and you're going to be maintaining both for a while. You're going to be documenting both. It's going to be a pain. And it will be hard to ever shut off the old one for the same reason that I said that it's difficult to ever deprecate anything permanently, because would we ever get to a point where we said, well, we're going to turn off anybody who was using GitLab CI before 2002, or sorry, 2020? Maybe, but it would have to be really, really important and really game changing. And I don't know what that might be yet. So in the meantime, it's better to just kind of manage the complexity, avoid adding complexity as much as possible, avoid adding new keywords as much as possible, try to build new features on top of existing keywords, add some flexibility in there, like some of the features around anchors and inheritance and things like that within the GitLab-ci.yml will allow you to do more complex things in a more I guess kind of like elegant way that doesn't add a ton of verbosity. And that's a good way to avoid that. But yeah, I mean, arguably, it's potentially already too complex, and that's what some of the team is working on the pipeline authoring side in order to reduce that complexity and figure out how we can make it simpler to get started. And then maybe once that work is done, maybe once we've got like the next 6 months of that thinking and features, then we'll have a better idea of what we were able to do, what we weren't able to do, and whether, you know, something bigger is going to be needed.
Yeah, and you, sorry, Ari had a follow-up, but I just want to ask one related to that pipeline authoring statement. Would you, you talked about there are kind of like two possible sensing mechanisms that would tell us it's getting too complex. The first one would be, is our own engineering effort so painful in order to add new capabilities? And the second one is, are users experiencing pain? You think that that would come up in when I'm authoring my CI/YAML? Like that pipeline authoring would be the ones who would sense like, hey, we can make the process easier, we can improve the documentation, but really the underlying language, syntax itself is too complex.
I think so, yeah. So within CI, we have kind of that two halves of the user split, and the people who interact with running pipelines and need to see if they're successful and troubleshoot them if not. And I think that the complexity there can be maintained, and we can just make that better and better and better, and we won't reach a point where it's like, well, it needs to do so many complicated things that that we don't know how to manage the complexity anymore. I think that will always be sort of maintainable. For various reasons, it's just kind of like a simpler flow. Whereas when you're authoring the pipelines, there's so much possibility of what you might, how you might approach solving the problem. It's really closer to a programming language than you know, interacting with a running system kind of. So I do suspect, to answer your question, that we would be hearing from users, maybe particularly like in new user adoption, that, you know, this is too complicated to get started. I have no idea what I'm doing. Maybe demand for professional services would go up and say like, look, we can't figure out how to set up pipelines with GitLab. Like, please give us some expert who can get this started for us. We're definitely not all the way to that point. Some companies might like that just because it's nice to have an expert and you can have confidence, but nobody's like, we looked at this, we cannot figure it out yet. But that could come, hopefully not.
Cool, thanks. Ori.
Yeah, well, Jason answered part of it. So how would we be able to migrate from V1 to V2 or even later on? The second part of the question you already answered.
It would depend on what V2 is. And I don't really know. If it's just a simpler version of pipelines, then maybe there is no migration, because if you're on the old one, then it's kind of like you're already on the more complex thing. And this would just be like a simplified syntax that you can use, and sort of it's in a bubble and works well. Another V2 that I could imagine would be something where there is no config, and it's more based on like auto build, auto DevOps type stuff. And then the migration to that is all in our end in the engineering. And it's making sure that maybe it's even parsing the config that they had to try and understand what was in the project. Maybe it's discarding it and trying to do the right thing. So that would be a slightly different migration path. Another one where it's just a new syntax that we've invented. Maybe it's compatible enough that we can write a migration script, like Miguel was touching on, where we can try and translate between the two and even automatically do it. So it will really depend on what the V2 is. And what was the other part to your question?
It was if we would need to support both of them, but you already answered that we would actually need to support them forever.
Okay.
There's another follow-up on this discussion that, oh, it's Frederick, you want to?
Yes. I was wondering, what is currently the most, like the feature you would say is the most asked from customer that is too complex or limiting from our existing YAML syntax that you see coming all the time?
I think it's related to defining the relationships between things. So it's related to the DAG. The DAG was a part of trying to solve this problem of what are the dependencies between different jobs and how do they relate to each other. Rules was the other portion of this that says, like, you know, based on, you can imagine these very complex webs of dependencies where this job should only run if this other job existed. And also if this other one passed, then it shouldn't run. But if the other one failed, then it should. And it depends on, it needs the artifacts from like these other 3 jobs that are actually in a whole other, branch of the build process. And defining that, those relationships in a very simple way is really, really hard. The DAG is good and it's better than what we had. Before, to start with, we only had the stages and you would just try and put everything in the next stage. But they would sort of end up in the situation where you were making many, many stages and kind of doing it all by hand and then moving things by hand in order to like optimize the timing and things like that. And it was really annoying. So we made the DAG, which lets you just say, this depends on this, depends on this, depends on this, and just build out the tree structure essentially. But then that tree structure, you're sort of doing it in text. So you're not really able to visualize it as you're doing it. The pipeline authoring team is working on visualization aspects in order to make that easier. And then how that interacts with rules to say when the job should run under what scenarios, depending on where it is in the tree. I think that's where the biggest complexity is for pipelines at the moment. Everything else, and even that, like for the basic use cases, is easy. But we have some customers who are doing things like they've got 1,000 dependencies all related to each other in these complex ways. And when you're managing that, it isn't easy. You can do it, but it's, yeah, some poor person has to maintain all of that and have it all in their head, and it's not easy.
Thanks, that answered the question.
Thanks.
Yeah, so
Go ahead, Miguel.
Question. I'm wondering if you can point to specific team members that you think that historically have become the main experts in the syntax. It might be something that we could do also in a follow-up. And perhaps even we want to have a GitLab CI experts designation in the team page.
That's a nice idea, actually. I like that. There's a few people who jump to mind. I'll probably forget somebody and I'll feel really bad about it in an hour when I remember them. But Camille obviously is probably the #1 expert for the GitLab CI.yml syntax. He built the runner, he built CI, like he was here at the very beginning and has seen it all develop. We've also got experts in different sub areas, like for rules. Furkan is the engineer who's really just an expert in that. He really understands it deeply. Fabio is the lead engineer and also knows it really, really well now. And then we also got some like heavy users at the company who know it. Steve on the runner team is somebody that I go to for advice. Jagorsh also on the, I don't know if he's on the CI or the pipeline authoring team these days or maybe floating, but he's also an expert. Josh in product does a lot of authoring of GitLab CI.ymls and knows how stuff works. Also, anybody who's maintaining, of course, the GitLab CI.ymls for building GitLab and for www and for the core product as well, you could reach out to. But I really like the idea of just maybe letting people add that as a tag on the team page that says, if you have kind of like merge request buddy, GitLab CI.yml syntax, power user maybe is, or something like that. That's a cool idea. And if anybody doesn't know who any of those people are, because I only mentioned their first names, you can ping me and I'll link you to them in Slack.
Cool. Thanks, Jason. Ari, you've got the next question.
Thank you. Is there a way to avoid endless loops in the pipeline?
Yeah, it's detectable already today, and we measure depth. And we limit depth. Fast recursion, like where you've just got like one job that starts another job and just kind of loops, that will be detected and it will stop. If you have something that's like really slow, where it like runs for 6 hours and then starts itself, it may run for quite some time. I'm actually not 100% sure how we're detecting and stopping that. But it is certainly, it's possible to set up loops, but I think for the most part, we are preventing unintentional cases where that's happening already. Or at least I haven't heard any come out lately.
I definitely did it recently, testing something locally, but I don't know if it's changed. Like by recently, I mean like a month ago. So I don't know if more stuff has rolled out, but this was like through multi-pipeline projects. So I posted about it so people know if it's still getting worked on. I don't totally know where it is, but yeah, if you're sneaky, you can do it.
Yeah, there's an API endpoint that starts a pipeline, which is the multi-project pipeline endpoint. And you could just call that at the end of your job, and it would just, whenever your job finishes, it would just start another copy. Yeah, I don't know how you would accidentally do that, but it's probably possible.
Cool, thanks. I have the next question, which is, you mentioned, one of the ways we limit complexity is by reusing existing keywords. I'm wondering how you think about, if you were to look at a new feature that would that implies the need for some new syntax or some new keyword, how you would think about, well, actually this could fit in an existing keyword, we might just extend it in some way.
Yeah.
How would you walk through that process?
I can illustrate an example of a recent one that we did. We were looking at matrix builds recently, which is a popular feature that a lot of people wanted. And it's essentially where you've got, like on one axis, you've got debug and release, for example, and then maybe Apple and Windows architectures on the other. And you want to run all 4 of those pipelines that would be in your matrix with the variables set for each one. And there's a lot of different discussions around different ways, and there are a ton of different ways that you could implement a keyword to do that. But what we ended up doing was adding on to the parallel keyword, which we already had. Parallel was just a keyword that would run, 10 copies of, if you wanted, of the same job. And you would typically use it if you've got like a test job, and you would tell it, each of these jobs should do 1/10 of the total test suite. So instead of introducing a new keyword, which it would add complexity, we said, okay, well, what if we look at that as a one-dimensional matrix? So it's just kind of like a matrix of one job is what we've set up there. And if we modify the syntax to allow for taking additional kind of dimensions on the matrix. So that's what we did. This is kind of a hard one to speak abstractly about. Hopefully it's coming across clearly.
Yeah.
But yeah, go ahead.
I wonder if part of it is tied with Miguel's point that consult with existing CIA experts. I'm we're losing a lot of expertise in you. Any new PM or team member who would come across something, it's not going to look exactly like that, but something similar. I'm trying to think of how to guide them to make sure we're considering first. Maybe it's just before you consider adding any new keyword, first ask yourself, of all the existing keywords, is there something we could extend?
Yeah, the other thing is that these tend to be popular issues whenever it's introducing something totally new. It tends to be an issue that's become very popular if we're looking at it. Otherwise, we'd be doing incremental things in the meantime. There tends to be a lot of really, really smart customers in those. So yeah, how we came up with that parallel keyword was just collaboration in the issue, comments in the issue, and different people were proposing different things. And some of the experts that I was talking about were participating there as well. People who care, me, people on the product team itself. And we just kind of came up with it through the discussion. You could probably even go look at that issue and look at the comments in it and see how we got there. But it really was just this open discussion, transparent discussion. One of the magic powers of GitLab that got us to that. And in all the cases, you can often feel that you haven't quite figured it out yet because it just seems kind of hacky, or it seems like over complex. And you just have a feeling that there must be some simpler way to do this that hasn't occurred to us yet. And you can also, if you don't feel that yourself, you don't have a sensitivity to that yet, then you can ask some of those power users if we make that list. And they'll tell you the same things like, yeah, that would work, but I don't know, it just seems like there must be some better way to do that. And if you've got that feeling, trust it, and keep challenging each other to try and find something more clever. Because you can't undo it once you ship it. We can't deprecate things. So if you ship something that's sort of awkward to use, there's going to be people using it. It's going to be very hard to ever turn it off. Yeah.
Cool. We talked at the top about avoiding becoming a kind of complete programming language, but there is some logic in the rules keyword and then also in the DAG for dependencies. How what guardrails would you put in to avoid us becoming the kind of like complete programming language that you were suggesting we should avoid?
Yeah, I mean, you just got to constrain it. So DAG actually doesn't have any logic, but the rules keyword does for sure. It allows you to set if statements essentially within the job. But it doesn't allow you to do it in a kind of open sense like you might be able to in a DSL. In a DSL, you might be able to just say something like, if this variable is set, then run all of these, set all of these variables that are going to be used as part of my object that's the job. Whereas we just say, we will evaluate the set of rules in this section, which is a series of if statements, whenever we're going to start this job. So it's very constrained as to when we analyze it. It's constrained to what you can, evaluate there. There's only if statements. So it's essentially, does this resolve to true or not? So in that way, we've limited it as much as we could.
What are there demands for taking the rules keyword further than you would suggest we should be comfortable that are out there today that you'd be like, there's already requests for this type of activity that I don't think we should go after?
Yeah, for sure. There's people who want the DSL, the full DSL experience. And it tends to be power users who are limited in some way, or just not just feel like, but like know that, they could do it better if given total freedom. Yeah, it's tough because they're not wrong, but it's sort of harmful to the commons if you just kind of like take all of the guardrails off. So yeah, the dynamic generation of the GitLab-ci.yml is one off-ramp for those kinds of users, where if they really are just kind of bouncing up against the limitations of the YAML syntax, then they can dynamically generate it and what they might need to do to express their what they want to do is like a very verbose file that may have hundreds of rules and hundreds of jobs, and it would just be very complex for any human to write. But they can write a program to do it, and it will just spit out all of that complex syntax, and they can have a very simple version in their own configuration, which is their script that just emits the GitLab-ci.yml. So that's one way that we kind of help those users. The other is to take it as an opportunity to deeply understand what their problem is and give features that help them, which again is not really what they're asking for, but it often gets us a better feature for more people. It's how that was the DAG essentially, is we came to the DAG by providing a feature there when people were just like, just let me, write a programming language inside of the GitLab-ci.yml. Another way that people can get around it is just reducing the number of jobs, so moving the complexity outside of the GitLab-ci.yml. So instead of doing everything inside of the GitLab-ci.yml, just write a script and then call that from a job, and then that can do more complex things. But then you miss some of the visualization. Like if the extreme case of that would be if somebody just had one job in their entire pipeline that ran a very complex script that did everything. And then if you looked at GitLab, all you would see is one job, and there wouldn't be very much information in there. It would just run for a really long time, and then when it was done, all of it would be done. Something we could potentially do there is allow for that script, if they were to go that route, to show more of its status inside of GitLab, like create virtual jobs and show virtual status that's related to that job.
Gotcha.
But I don't know, we've never gotten close to going down that route, but it's something that you could imagine for that kind of use case.
Cool. I had the last question in the doc. If others have any, feel free to chime in. Mine was, you have spoken to me eloquently about the, like one of the reasons why we want to avoid the DSL is because others who've gone down that path have just, I actually don't know what the pitfall is when it happens, but I'd love to hear more about it. But you've kind of warned that others who've gone down the make it a DSL has caused significant pain. Could you maybe talk through some industry examples of that happening?
It's maintainability is really what it all comes down to, and how much expertise do you need to have on your build team, if you've got one, or just kind of like the build function within your team. You can build really complex, elegant, nice systems if you've got build engineers who are working on it and maintaining it and deeply understanding it. But most teams, most companies just kind of, it's like everybody's shared job to maintain the build system. And so having, really clever code in your build system just makes it harder to maintain downstream. It's like, I won't name names, but I used to work with a programming language earlier in my career that was known for being write once and then never be able to read it again. And it's kind of like that, where you can get all this stuff set up, but then when it breaks, you need the expert to figure out what had happened. Whereas our configuration, almost, most of the time, for the vast majority of cases, like you can just go look at it and really kind of just read it, look at the pipeline that ran and figure out what went wrong, or where, at least where it went wrong. And it's so much easier to maintain and make little tweaks and improvements and keep things working, rather than if you just implement the whole thing arbitrarily in code. And you kind of have to understand the whole thing in order to figure out how to make it work. So yeah, that's the main reason, is to avoid that trap of having a complicated build system that only a few people, or even nobody, if they leave, can understand how it works.
Do you think that's one of the principles? We haven't said that in this conversation, nor have I expressed it before, but that maintainability, by having it be readable and easily understandable by someone who is outside of the authoring group. Like we should strive to create a syntax for a CI that allows anyone to look at it. And if it's so complex that somebody looking at the pipeline YAML definition can't immediately understand what's going on, then that should be an alarm bell for us.
Yeah, that's nicely put. You shouldn't need a team of experts to write your GitLab-ci YAMLs. When I think about the pipeline authoring group at companies, it's the people who fill in. It's like, it can be a lot of different people. Sometimes it's the expert engineer, sometimes it's the guy who just started, or gal who just started. It's different people. Sometimes it is dedicated, but yeah, it just needs to be simple, because managing the build system is not producing values for the users of these companies. So the less time they spend on it, the happier they tend to be. And if we're finding that people are spending a lot of time having to do it, or if you need a build engineering team in order to make GitLab work, then we've really gone down the path of complexity to a point where we need to make an adjustment right away.
Okay, that's great. I'm typing too fast also. There aren't any other questions in the doc. Anyone else have a question they want to verbalize? Cool. Just before I turn off the live stream, thank you, Jason, for participating. I'm going to take this document and consider writing with probably Dove and Tao, like principles of CI/YAML syntax that we can start iterating on. I'll share it. So anyone who wants to contribute to it, I would appreciate it.
Cool. Thanks so much, Kenny.
Yep. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
I'll also mention I have a general AMA on Wednesday. So if anybody, it's either Wednesday or Thursday. So ping me if you don't already have an invite. It's on the ops calendar, and that will just be an AMA for any topic, any question at all that anybody wants to ask. So small plug for that. Cool.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.